It's Whiteboard Wednesday. You've been warned. This week we looked at a message about God warning us, and it was from Matthew 2, and we see God warn Joseph and we see God warn the wise men. And both of the warnings that God gives were directed towards Herod. They were in response to Herod. Herod was trying to stamp out or get rid of Jesus because he wanted to be the king, and Jesus was considered and called the King of the Jews at the time. And so as I was thinking about that, I was thinking that the world and Satan wants to get Jesus out of our lives. And so these two warnings, I think, can translate to us in the warning that he gave Joseph, which was to not to stay. The warning that he gave to the wise men, which was no turning back. Now, as we think about these two warnings, the first one, not to stay, what that means for us is it's basically talking about complacency. For Joseph, he was saying, don't stay where you're at, but get away, because Herod is going to try to beat down Jesus, try to kill Jesus. And so in order for Jesus to be alive in that moment, and I believe for us, for Jesus to be alive in our own lives, we cannot be complacent. We cannot be sitting idle. We cannot be sitting still. We even have pictures of the Dead Sea and how there's nothing flowing out of it, and so it's just dead. It's the place of death. When we become that way, it stamps and kills out Jesus in our lives. We don't hear His voice. We become hardened to the Spirit of God, and it's not what God's called us to. And in fact, He calls Joseph not just not to stay, but to go to Egypt. And in the Bible, Egypt represents this place of opposition to God. And so one of the ways that we can tell if we've been complacent is if we've not seen ourselves going towards the opposition of God. Maybe it's people or ideas. Are we not chasing after people who are far from God, who oppose God? If we're not doing that, then we're setting idle, we're setting complacent. And so maybe God's calling you out not to stay, but to chase after those who oppose God, chase after those who are far from God. The second one is no turning back, and He gives this to the wise men. And as we looked at the story 2 weeks ago, the wise men, they followed the star, but then they got to a point where they actually asked for directions, but then they come back and follow the star again. So I had to ask the question, what happened during that time? And I feel like what happened is they took their eyes off the star and they resorted to worldly wisdom. And so when God comes to them and warns the wise men, He says, don't go back to Herod. What He's saying is, don't go back to thinking like the world or looking to the world to give you the information that you need for life. And the reality is how we think results out in how we act. And if you look at the wise men, they responded to the warning by thinking differently, and we can see that because the way they acted, they didn't go back to the way they were. And so my question to you is have you turned back to a worldly way of thinking? Have you resorted to your own wisdom and your own knowledge or the knowledge of the world rather than what God is calling us to do, whether it's in your workplace or in your home? See, the reality is these wise men, they went back to the same life. They went back to the same life, but they went with a changed heart. And that's the question for us. We go back to the same jobs. We go back to the same home with the same wife, with the same kids, or with the same husband and the same kids, or the same employment, whatever that looks like, but have we went back differently? So when we think about the warning to not turn back, it's not necessarily a change in directions. It's more a change of the heart and a change of the mind and being different back in the same life that we're living. And if we heed these warnings, we actually keep the voice alive in our lives. We hear Jesus more. We don't harden our hearts towards Him. That's the warnings of a loving God. It's because He wants Jesus to be alive in us and living and coming through us. So let's not stay. Let's not turn back. Hey, we hope you liked the video. If you want to check out our last video, click here. If you want to follow us on social media, any of our platforms, check here. And if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please check here.